the Panther tank AUSF-G. Whether deep in the wilderness or on the battlefields of the Second World War, it pays to be wary of big cats. One of the most legendary tanks of that conflict was the German Panzer V Panther, a vehicle which struck fear into the hearts of the Allies who faced it. Origins. While the search for a replacement for the Panzer IV tank began in 1938, the origin of the Panther began after Operation Barbarossa in 1941. In spite of the overwhelming success of the early stages of the invasion, German High Command began to worry about the effectiveness of its Panzer III and IVs against the Soviet T-34s and KV-1s they were encountering. After careful study of captured T-34s, a competition was set up to produce a new medium tank that could compete with it on the battlefield. Several prototypes were put forward from Krupps, Daimler-Benz, and others. The winning design was a prototype made by Maschinenfabrik Augsburg-Nürnberg, or MAN, was selected in late 1942. After a few more adjustments, the newly developed tank went into production in January of 1943. It was given the designation of Panzerkampfwagen 5 Panther, and it was first sent into combat that July on the Eastern Front. Variants. Over the course of the war, there were several variants of the Panther. Confusingly, the first to enter production was the AUSF-D, AUSF being the abbreviation on the German word Ausführung, or version. The next model was the AUSF-A, followed by the AUSF-G. This is in contrast to other German tank designations, where the first type in a production run is given the A designation, then B, and so on. The G variant was the last production variant of the Panther to enter combat, though there was an F variant with the updated turret and a Panther II tank that was also planned, though the war ended before either made it to the production line. It was an update of the AUSF-A on a redesigned chassis and had modifications to make production easier and cheaper. Dimensions. The Panzer AUSF-G measures in at 29 feet in length, 11 feet in width, and a height of 10 feet, or 8.86 meters by 3.42 meters by 3.1 meters. The weight of the Panther is 45 metric tons, slightly heavier than the D variant, though still considerably lighter than the Tiger, which weighed in at 54 tons. The Panther was a smaller and more maneuverable alternative to the Tiger series of tanks and was classified by German High Command as a medium tank. Crew. Like all versions of the Panther, the AUSF-G had a crew of 5 men, a commander, driver, gunner, loader, and radio operator, who was also a machine gunner. The commander would be located in a cupola at the rear of the turret, behind the gunner and loader. The driver would be seated lower in the hull on the left side of the vehicle. To his right would be the radio operator. In earlier versions, the driver would view the world through an armored viewport cut into the hull. In order to mitigate this obvious weak point, the opening was replaced by a single traversable periscope. This had the additional benefit of simplifying the production process. Armament. The main gun of the Panzer AUSF-G, like all the other variants, was a 75mm high-velocity cannon. While this is the same caliber as the main gun of the M4 Sherman, it has a much higher muzzle velocity due to a larger powder charge and longer barrel. This gave the main gun of the Panther excellent armor penetration against Allied tanks. The AUSF-G carried 82 rounds of ammunition for the main gun, a slight increase over the 79 rounds of earlier versions. The second armament of the Panther were a pair of MG-34 7.92mm machine guns. One was located in the turret coaxially to the main gun. The second was located at the bow of the gun and utilized by the radio operator. Armor. The AUSF-G, like all versions of the Panther, made use of sloped armor, known as glacis plates, which was inspired by studies of the Soviet T-34. This feature increased the protection while reducing weight. In order to further reduce the vehicle's weight, the sides and rear would have thinner armor than the front. The frontal armor of the Panther was 80mm thick, and due to the sloping, meant that an enemy shell would effectively have to penetrate around 100mm of armor, something that many Allied guns, especially the 75mm cannon of the M4 Sherman, had difficulty in accomplishing. The sides and rear of the Panther were thinner at 45mm in thickness, and the top of the tank was relatively thin at 30mm. Because of the thickness of the frontal armor and relative vulnerability of the flanks, Allied tank crews would attempt to maneuver around the side of the Panther to score a kill. The AUSF-G also had thicker side pannier armor compared to earlier variants, which protected the upper portion of tracks and suspension system. Engine and fuel. The Panther Alf's G was propelled by a Maybach V12 water-cooled petrol engine capable of generating 600 horsepower. It could move the vehicle at a top speed of 46 kilometers per hour, or 28.5 miles per hour. The fuel capacity was 730 liters, or 190 gallons, giving the Panther an operational range of around 200 kilometers, or 124 miles. The Panther Alf's G had a ZF AK-7 200 transmission. This allowed for 7 gears moving forward and 1 in reverse. Production. During the course of the war, around 6,000 Panthers were built, the Alf's G making the majority of around 3,000. They were produced by a number of manufacturers, primarily Maschinenfabrik Augsburg-Nürnberg, but also Maschinenfabrik Niedersachsen Hanover and Daimler-Benz. Night vision. A number of Panther Alf's G were equipped with the state-of-the-art FG-1250 Sperber or Sparrowhawk infrared night fighting scope. This device was located in the commander's cupola, where it was connected to an image converter and a machine that sensed the elevation of the main gun. This gave the commander a limited amount of night vision up to 600 meters away, though only the commander had this ability, the rest of the crew reliant on his orders. It's unknown how many were equipped with this technology, with estimates ranging from around 20 to over 50. In January of 1945, it was ordered that all Panthers would have this feature, though it's unknown if this was carried out. Flaws. In spite of its advantages, the Panther was not without its flaws. Like most German tanks, they were much more complex and unreliable compared to their Allied counterparts. The first was the track and suspension system. Like most German tanks, the Panther utilized 18 interleaved wheels, or road wheels that overlapped one another. Such a configuration gave the tank more mobility and more evenly distributed its weight, but it came at the cost of complexity. In order to repair the suspension system, several overlapping wheels would have to be removed to access the internal workings, a complex and time-consuming task, especially in a war zone. Many of the earlier variants of the Panther suffered engine and transmission problems, with significant numbers being out of action due to mechanical failures. By the creation of the Alf's G, many of these issues were mitigated, but the Panther did suffer from reduced reliability compared to their Allied counterparts. Another flaw was the Panther's armor. While the sloped armor of the Panther was generally effective at deflecting enemy shells, as the war progressed and Allied strategic bombing ravaged German industry, flaws in the manufacturing process made the steel brittle. Even if the shot was deflected, there was a risk that the impact would shatter the metal, damaging the tank beyond repair or making it vulnerable to a follow-up shot. The final flaw of the Panther was its limited production run. Of all the variants, around 6,000 were created, around 3,000 being the Alf's G, paling in comparison to the estimated 84,000 T-34s and 50,000 M4 Shermans they faced, any advantage in quality being nullified by sheer weight of numbers. Legacy. The Panther first saw combat on the Eastern Front in July of 1943. From then on, it served in all operational theaters. The Wehrmacht deployed tank forces until the German surrender in May 1945. During that time, the Panther garnered a reputation as one of the finest tanks in use by the Germans, being feared and respected by the Allies who faced it. Many argue about it being the best tank of the war, and in spite of its flaws, could possibly be considered among the top armored vehicles of the Second World War. Panther Turrets. Cross-section. During the Second World War, the German army gained renown for their fast-paced maneuver warfare, which allowed them to overrun entire nations in short order. After their initial successes, however, the Wehrmacht found itself on the defensive. Though tanks and their mobility were still a vital part of the war effort, some were converted to a much more stationary role. Origins and concept. The idea of using tanks as a fixed bunker is obvious, at least in hindsight. Tanks by their nature are resilient, designed to withstand considerable punishment, while being able to unleash considerable firepower of their own. Furthermore, the First World War taught militaries around the world that tanks would be a vital component of any future conflict, and vehicles were produced in considerable numbers. These designs could become outdated quickly, as new technologies and methodologies led to the creation of more advanced tanks. Rather than scrap the obsolete designs, many were converted into makeshift bunkers at strategic locations. The first nations to do this were the Soviet Union, France, and Belgium. As they switched to a more defensive posture, the Wehrmacht made use of this tactic themselves, creating purpose-built tank bunkers. One type, nicknamed a Tobruk by the Allies after a Libyan city where they were first encountered, was a simple version of this concept. They were small, one-man bunkers usually armed with a machine gun or a small mortar, made from concrete, and topped with a small tank turret, such as captured French Renault light tanks. Sometimes, however, something more substantial was in order. Several defensive lines were devised by the German High Command to protect German territorial gains made in the early phases of the war, such as the Panther Wotan line on the Eastern Front, the Atlantic Wall in northern France, as well as others in Italy and Germany. This need led to the development of what was called the Panther Turret. Among the arsenals of tanks used by the Germans, one of the most effective was the Panther medium tank. The decision to use the modern Panther Turret as opposed to outdated designs was due to turret production outstripping the pace of Panther hulls. Rather than leave the already produced turrets in storage, they were pressed into service as stationary defenses. Variants. In the closing months of 1943, plans were drawn up for these lines of defenses, with Panther Turrets as a key element. The basic idea was very simple. A bunker would be dug, with the tank's turret used as the main weapon. There were three main variants of the design. The Panther Turret Einstahluntersatz, or steel support, was the first variant, intended to act as a cheaper and less time-consuming alternative for typical German concrete bunkers. Steel bases were chosen over concrete ones because steel could be installed during the upcoming freezing winter months. Panther Turret Ein would be made with prefabricated steel components welded together on site. In places where the front was more static, such as the Atlantic Wall, the Germans made use of a second variant called the Panther Turret 2 Betonsockel, or concrete base. These were sturdy, providing the occupants with significant protection. A third variant, called the Schnelleinbau, or fast construction, would be made from wood and was also known as the Holzunterstand. Dimensions and sections. The bunker was divided into two major sections. The upper section was a square box roughly 3 meters by 3 meters and about a meter in height. Over the top of this section, the turret would be mounted. This compartment served as storage for ammunition and could hold up to 175 rounds of tank shells, while 4,500 rounds of machine gun ammo would be stored in the turret itself. The walls were up to 3 inches thick, providing the crew with significant protection. Underneath this upper chamber was a lower section. It was larger than the fighting compartment, around 6 feet in height, and was itself divided into different compartments. The first was the living compartment for the crew, which consisted of a commander, gunner, and loader, and had folding bunk beds and a stove that doubled as a heating system, which was attached to a flue for ventilation. Another section served as general storage, mostly for machinery and other odds and ends needed to maintain the bunker, and housed a 2-horsepower motor which powered the turret, a 150-amp battery, and a compressed air tank. The compressed air was needed to vent the barrel after firing, or the bunker would overheat, forcing the crew to open the hatches for sufficient ventilation, defeating the purpose of a sealed bunker. At the rear of the compartment was an escape hatch, which led to a vertical shaft, equipped with a ladder for access to the outside. Normal entry to the bunker was through a slit trench, which could measure up to 40 feet behind the installation. These were often connected to a much more extensive trench system. Turret and armament. For the most part, Panther Ausf-D and Ausf-A turrets were used for the role of stationary bunker. The Panther tank, regardless of type, utilized a powerful 75mm main gun. This is the same caliber it was found on the American M4 Sherman, which has a reputation as being a grossly underpowered main weapon. The German counterpart, however, had a more powerful powder charge to propel the shell and a much longer barrel, which allowed the expanding gases of the propellant to build up to a much higher degree, giving the shell a higher muzzle velocity. Because of this, the main gun could rip through all but the toughest armored vehicles. They were also equipped with a 7.92 coaxial MG-34 machine gun, useful for defending against infantry. The turret of the Panther was heavily armored, being up to 110mm of steel at the front and around 80mm at the sides, though this could vary based on the specific model of the tank used. This armor would also be sloped, which added to the protection provided by the steel. In addition to using the Ausf-D and Ausf-A Panther turrets, dedicated turrets were created. Based on the Panther designs, these were designated Panther Ostwaldturm and were simpler in design than those placed on actual tanks. The name roughly translates as Panther East Wall Tower, as they were initially intended to be used on the Eastern Front, though due to the more dynamic nature of the fighting there, most were sent against the West, particularly in Italy and along the Atlantic Wall. Some were also improvised during the defense of Berlin in the final stages of the war. Panther Turrets in combat. Panther turrets would be arranged in groups of 12, with interlocking fields of fire and connected to a larger defensive network. They would be positioned at strategic locations, ideally on elevated ground, though not at the summit, but slightly lower to decrease the silhouette. When properly installed, the Panther bunkers would have a low profile and could be camouflaged, meaning they could surprise an advancing enemy and, if discovered, were difficult to hit. The thick, sloped armor meant that even direct hits could potentially glance off. Because the armor was thicker at the front, enemies would often be forced to attempt to flank the bunker, putting them into the firing line of another emplacement. There were some downsides, however. The positions would be camouflaged, but this limited their firing arc. The turret could turn a full 360 degrees if there were no other obstructions, but this would push aside any concealment that may have been placed to mask it from the enemy. Once discovered, the low profile and durable construction made destroying it from the ground difficult. Panther turrets were, however, thinner at the sides compared to the front, making them vulnerable to flanking. By the later stages in the war, the Allies had near total air superiority, making the turret vulnerable to airstrikes as well as long-range artillery, for which they had no real defense against. Overall, the use of Panther Turret and other similar structures was a simple and cost-effective way to utilize scarce resources to hold on to ground already captured by German forces. In the later stages of the conflict, German logistics and industry was in shambles, and the use of the Panther Turret and other similar structures allowed them to recycle tanks that were already produced but were no longer operable. Tanks knocked out by enemy action, mechanical failure, or just a simple lack of fuel would not have to be scrapped or abandoned, but could still contribute to the war effort. We upload all the videos that we have to censor from YouTube to our Patreon. Right now, you can watch uncensored videos on the Battle of Compiègne, medieval warfare, and the Sherman tank, all on Patreon. History is epic. Watch it uncensored.